In the beginning, there was only the endless expanse of grass and wind, stretching across the ancient world like a vast green sea beneath an infinite dome of sky. The earth breathed slowly in those distant millennia, unmarked by the geometric patterns of fields or the angular shadows of walls, knowing only the gentle rhythm of seasons and the patient migration of rivers carving their eternal paths through virgin soil. Time moved differently then, measured not in years or centuries, but in the imperceptible shifts of climate and the gradual dance of water finding its way to the sea. Between the headwaters of two great rivers, in a land that would one day be called Mesopotamia, the world held its breath and waited for something unprecedented to unfold. The Tigris and Euphrates descended from the Armenian highlands like twin serpents of life, carrying with them the rich sediments of distant mountains, the accumulated fertility of 1,000 valleys, spreading their gifts across the broad alluvial plain that stretched endlessly toward the Persian Gulf. Here, where the rivers meandered and merged, separated and rejoined in an intricate choreography of water and earth, the soil grew thick and black and impossibly rich, fed by millennia of flooding and renewal. The morning mist rose from these waters like the breath of sleeping gods, drifting across marshlands where reeds grew tall and straight as spears, rustling with the secret conversations of wind and water. Wild barley and emmer wheat sprouted in scattered patches across the fertile floodplains, their golden heads swaying in the warm breeze that carried the scent of river mud and growing things. Date palms stood sentinel along the watercourses, their fronds catching and filtering the harsh desert light into patterns of green shadow that danced across the marshy ground below. In this cradle between rivers, humanity began to dream of permanence. For countless generations, people had followed the ancient paths of their ancestors, moving with the seasons like all other creatures, carrying their lives with them in bundles of worked hide and woven grass. They knew the secret waterholes of the desert, the mountain passes where game was plentiful, the coastal marshes where fish gathered in silver multitudes. But here, in this land of endless fertility, something stirred in the human heart that had never stirred before. A longing to stay, to sink roots as deep as the date palms, to become part of the landscape rather than merely passing through it. The wild grasses that grew in such abundance along the riverbanks whispered of possibilities that earlier generations had never imagined. These hardy cereals, ancestors of wheat and barley, offered more than temporary sustenance. They promised abundance that could be stored, planned for, counted upon. The patient observation of countless seasons revealed their secrets, how they grew from seed to harvest, how they could be gathered and kept, how they responded to the flooding of the rivers and the retreat of the waters. Knowledge accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of understanding building up in the collective memory of the people. The first tentative experiments in cultivation began not as grand designs for civilization, but as simple acts of hope and curiosity. A handful of seeds pressed into the mud after the flood waters receded, marked perhaps with a stick or stone, so the planter might remember where the experiment was tried. The waiting then, through the long months of growth, watching as green shoots pushed through the dark earth, tending them as one might tend a flame, protecting them from the grazing of wild animals, learning the rhythms of water and sun and soil that would nurture them to harvest. These early harvests, modest though they were, created something revolutionary in human experience. A surplus that could sustain people through seasons of scarcity, that could free some hands from the constant search for food to pursue other activities. The implications rippled outward like circles on still water, touching every aspect of human existence. Storage required containers, and containers required craftsmanship. Planning required record-keeping, and record-keeping required symbols. Defense of the stored surplus required organization, and organization required leadership. The scattered bands of hunter-gatherers who had roamed these lands for millennia began to cluster around the most fertile spots along the rivers, their temporary camps evolving into seasonal settlements, then into permanent villages. Reed huts gave way to structures of sun-dried mud brick, their walls growing higher and stronger with each generation. The circular patterns of nomadic camps transformed into the rectangular geometry of settled life, streets and squares emerging from the organic arrangement of dwellings around communal spaces. Along the riverbanks, where the soil was deepest and the water most reliable, the first fields took shape, their boundaries marked not by natural features, but by human intention. Irrigation channels began as simple diversions of seasonal floods, but grew into networks of canals and levees that could control and direct the life-giving waters with increasing sophistication. The landscape itself became a partner in this great experiment, responding to human intervention with abundant yields that supported ever larger populations. Trade routes emerged like spiderwebs across the region, connecting settlements along the rivers and reaching out into the surrounding highlands and deserts where different resources could be found. Obsidian from the volcanic regions to the north, timber from the mountain forests, stones for tools and building from distant quarries, all began to flow along pathways marked by the feet of merchants and travelers. The exchange of goods brought with it the exchange of ideas, techniques, spreading from village to village. Innovations crossing vast distances on the backs of pack animals and in the memories of wandering craftsmen. In the quiet evenings, when the day's work was done and the cooking fires sent columns of smoke rising into the darkening sky, storytellers would gather the community around them and spin tales of the world beyond their fields and walls. These stories carried more than entertainment. They preserved the accumulated wisdom of generations. The hard-won knowledge of farming and building, of weather patterns and seasonal cycles, of the proper relationships between people and the supernatural forces that governed their world. The villages grew larger and more complex with each passing generation, their populations swelling as the agricultural surplus supported more and more people. Specialization became possible as not everyone needed to be directly involved in food production. Potters perfected their craft, creating vessels of increasing beauty and utility. Weavers developed new techniques for working the fibers of flax and wool into textiles of remarkable fineness. Metalworkers learned to extract copper from ore and shape it into tools more durable than stone or bone. Religious practices evolved alongside the practical innovations, as people sought to understand and influence the forces that controlled their newfound prosperity. Shrines and temples rose at the centers of settlements, dedicated to deities who governed the rivers and the floods, the sun and the rain, the fertility of the earth, and the success of the harvest. These sacred spaces became focal points for community identity, their construction requiring unprecedented cooperation and organization among large numbers of people. The priests who tended these temples accumulated not just spiritual authority, but practical power as well, as they became the keepers of the calendar, the predictors of floods, the mediators between human needs and divine will. Around these religious centers, the first true cities began to coalesce, drawing people from smaller settlements throughout the region, becoming magnets for trade and craftsmanship, learning and innovation. The transformation from wandering to dwelling unfolded like the slow turning of seasons across countless generations, as the descendants of those first river valley settlers began to feel the pull of permanence beneath their feet. The ancient rhythms that had carried their ancestors across vast distances, following herds through shifting grasslands, tracking seasonal migrations, reading the subtle signs written in wind and weather, began to give way to new patterns, new connections to the earth itself. Where once there had been the constant motion of survival, the endless search for sustenance that kept communities fluid and mobile, there emerged instead the revolutionary concept of staying, of putting down roots as deep as those of the wild wheat that grew along the riverbanks. The earliest farming communities arose not through sudden inspiration, but through generations of careful observation, patient experimentation, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge passed from parent to child, like precious heirlooms. These proto-farmers watched the wild grasses that flourished in the rich alluvial soil left behind by flooding rivers, noting how certain varieties grew thicker and taller, how their seeds scattered and took root in predictable patterns. The transition began with simple interventions. clearing competing vegetation from around particularly productive stands of wild grain, perhaps protecting favored areas from grazing animals, slowly learning to recognize which seeds would yield the most abundant harvests when deliberately scattered in prepared ground. The first tentative gardens appeared as small clearings near permanent water sources, modest plots where wild emmer wheat and barley were encouraged to grow in dense, manageable stands. These early cultivators developed an intimate understanding of the soil's moods and needs, learning to read the subtle differences in earth texture that meant the difference between abundance and failure. They discovered that certain areas held moisture longer after floods receded, that south-facing slopes caught more warming sunlight, that the decomposing organic matter left by receding waters created particularly fertile growing conditions. Each small revelation built upon previous knowledge, creating an ever-expanding foundation of agricultural wisdom. The tools of this transformation were beautifully simple: wooden digging sticks worn smooth by countless hands, flat stones used for grinding grain into flour, woven baskets that could hold both seeds for planting and the precious harvest that resulted. Clay vessels began to appear, shaped by patient hands from the river's abundant mud, fired in simple hearths to create storage containers that could protect grain from moisture, rodents, and decay. These ceramic innovations represented more than mere practicality. They embodied a fundamental shift in thinking about time and planning, the radical concept that surplus could be saved for future seasons of scarcity. As agricultural knowledge deepened and refined, the earliest farming settlements began to take on the characteristics that would define civilized life for millennia to come. Houses evolved from temporary shelters into permanent structures built to last for generations, their walls rising from foundations of stone and sun-dried brick, their rooms organized around central courtyards where families gathered to process grain, share meals, and pass down the accumulated wisdom of successful cultivation. These homes became repositories of tools and knowledge, places where specialized equipment could be stored and maintained, where the complex seasonal cycles of planting, tending, and harvesting could be planned and coordinated with neighbors and relatives. The surplus that agriculture made possible transformed social relationships in profound and lasting ways. Where nomadic groups had necessarily remained small and mobile, farming communities could support larger populations concentrated in permanent locations. Extended families could remain together across multiple generations, allowing for the development of complex kinship networks and the specialized division of labor that would become hallmarks of civilized society. Some individuals could devote themselves entirely to crafts like pottery, weaving, or tool-making, trading their specialized skills for food produced by others, creating the first networks of economic interdependence that would eventually span continents. Religious and spiritual life underwent equally dramatic transformation as agricultural communities developed their own sacred rhythms tied to the cycles of planting and harvest. The natural world, once experienced primarily through the lens of hunting and gathering, came to be understood through the more intimate relationship of cultivation and stewardship. Sacred sites emerged at locations associated with particularly bountiful harvests or successful plantings, marked by stone circles or small shrines where offerings of first fruits expressed gratitude for the earth's generosity. The deities worshipped in these early farming communities reflected agricultural concerns. Fertility goddesses associated with abundant harvests, weather gods whose moods determined the success of crops, earth spirits believed to dwell in particularly productive fields. The architecture of these settlements revealed the growing sophistication of their inhabitants, with buildings designed not just for shelter, but for the specific needs of agricultural life. Granaries rose on elevated foundations to protect stored grain from flooding and pests, their thick walls providing insulation against temperature extremes that could spoil precious harvests. Work areas were organized around the seasonal demands of farming: outdoor spaces for winnowing grain, covered areas for tool maintenance and repair, specialized structures for food processing and storage that reflected generations of accumulated knowledge about preservation techniques. Trade relationships began to flourish as agricultural surplus allowed for the luxury of exchange beyond immediate subsistence needs. Obsidian from distant volcanic regions found its way into farming settlements, traded for surplus grain or specialized pottery, creating some of humanity's first long-distance commercial networks. These trading connections brought not only exotic materials, but new ideas, techniques, and innovations that accelerated the development of agricultural communities. Knowledge about crop rotation, pest control, and irrigation spread along trade routes, allowing successful innovations developed in one region to benefit farming communities hundreds of miles away. The social complexity that emerged from agricultural surplus laid the groundwork for many institutions that would become central to civilized life. Leadership roles evolved beyond the temporary authority of skilled hunters or charismatic individuals, developing into more permanent positions based on expertise in agricultural planning, trade negotiations, or religious ceremonies. The need to coordinate planting schedules, manage communal irrigation projects, and resolve disputes over land use created some of humanity's first formal governance structures. Simple but effective systems that would eventually evolve into the complex political hierarchies of the world's first city-states. Archaeological evidence from these early farming settlements reveals the gradual accumulation of material culture that marked the transition from nomadic to sedentary life. Tool technologies became increasingly sophisticated, with specialized implements designed for specific agricultural tasks. Sickles for harvesting grain, hoes for soil preparation, grinding stones perfectly shaped for processing different types of seeds and nuts. Pottery styles developed regional characteristics that reflected local preferences and traditions, creating some of the earliest expressions of cultural identity tied to specific geographic locations rather than kinship groups. The transformation of the landscape itself reflected the growing influence of agricultural communities on their environment. Forests were cleared to create new fields, wetlands were drained to expand arable land, and simple irrigation channels were dug to direct precious water to crops during dry seasons. These modifications represented humanity's first large-scale environmental engineering projects, fundamentally altering ecosystems in ways that would support dramatically larger populations, while creating the foundation for the urban civilizations that would soon emerge along the rivers of Mesopotamia. Each settlement building upon the agricultural innovations and social structures developed by these pioneering farming communities, whose patient experiments with cultivation had transformed scattered nomadic bands into the world's first stable, permanent societies. The transformation from scattered farming settlements to something altogether more magnificent began along the banks of the Euphrates River, where the muddy waters carried both life and promise across the endless Mesopotamian plain. Here, in a landscape that stretched unbroken toward distant horizons, the seeds of urban civilization began to take root in ways that would forever alter the course of human history. The small agricultural communities that had emerged from nomadic wandering were about to give birth to something unprecedented, the world's first true city, rising like a mirage from the fertile alluvium of ancient Sumer. Uruk emerged gradually from the merger of two earlier settlements, Anu and Kulaba, their boundaries slowly dissolving as population growth and prosperity drew them together into a single, sprawling urban entity. The process unfolded over generations, as families built their mud brick homes closer and closer together, creating narrow, winding streets that followed the natural contours of the land. Gardens and courtyards provided breathing space between the growing clusters of dwellings, while irrigation canals threaded through the expanding settlement like silver ribbons, bringing life-giving water from the great river to every corner of the emerging metropolis. The heart of this revolutionary settlement beat strongest around its sacred precincts, where massive temple complexes rose from platforms of sun-baked brick toward the endless sky. The White Temple, gleaming like polished bone against the azure heavens, stood as a beacon visible from vast distances across the flat countryside, its stepped ziggurat form casting long shadows that marked the passage of time across the urban landscape below. Priests in flowing robes moved through courtyards filled with the smoke of burning offerings, their chanted prayers drifting on desert winds that carried the mingled scents of incense, barley beer, and the earthy richness of the river's edge. Within the temple precincts, scribes bent over clay tablets in the cool shade of colonnaded halls, their reed styluses making precise impressions in the soft clay as they recorded the complex transactions that kept this growing city functioning. These early records spoke of barley stored in massive granaries, of sheep and cattle counted and recounted, of workers assigned to dig new canals or repair the great walls that were beginning to encircle the city's expanding perimeter. The wedge-shaped marks they pressed into clay represented humanity's first steps toward preserving knowledge beyond the fragile boundaries of memory, creating an eternal record written in the earth itself. The streets of Uruk hummed with activity as dawn broke each day over the eastern marshlands, flooding the city with golden light that transformed mud brick walls into surfaces of warm amber and honey. Merchants arranged their wares in the growing marketplace, displaying pottery vessels glazed in deep blues and greens, textiles woven with intricate patterns, and precious stones that caught and reflected the morning sun. The air filled with the calls of vendors advertising their goods, the lowing of cattle being driven through the gates, and the rhythmic hammering of metalworkers shaping copper and bronze into tools and ornaments of increasing sophistication. Beyond the city's walls, the agricultural landscape stretched in all directions, crisscrossed by an intricate network of irrigation channels that brought order to what had once been wild wetlands and desert margins. Farmers worked their assigned plots with wooden ploughs pulled by patient oxen, turning the rich black soil to plant barley and wheat that would feed the thousands of mouths within the city's boundaries. Date palm groves provided sweet fruit and shade, their fronds rustling in the constant breeze that swept across the plain, while fishermen cast their nets in the canals and river backwaters, bringing in silver catches that would grace the tables of priests and administrators. The social fabric of Uruk grew more complex with each passing generation, as specialization allowed individuals to pursue crafts and professions far removed from the basic necessities of food production. Master craftsmen established workshops where apprentices learned to work precious metals into intricate jewelry, to carve cylinder seals with mythological scenes, and to throw pottery vessels of such refinement that they seemed to capture light within their glazed surfaces. Musicians developed sophisticated instruments and composed melodies that echoed through temple halls and private courtyards. Their haunting tunes, speaking of a culture that had moved far beyond mere survival to embrace beauty and artistic expression. The city's rulers emerged from this increasingly stratified society, establishing palaces that rivaled the temples in their grandeur and complexity. These early kings, their authority derived from both divine sanction and practical necessity, oversaw the massive public works projects that allowed Uruk to continue growing and prospering. Under their direction, armies of workers expanded the canal systems, raised ever higher defensive walls, and constructed public buildings that served the needs of a population that now numbered in the tens of thousands. The very scale of these undertakings spoke to an unprecedented level of social organization, requiring coordination and planning that surpassed anything the world had previously seen. Trade networks began to radiate outward from Uruk like spokes from a great wheel, carrying the city's influence and products to distant lands while bringing back exotic materials and new ideas. Merchants traveled the rivers in boats loaded with textiles and metalwork, following ancient routes that connected the Mesopotamian heartland to the mountains of Anatolia, the forests of the Levant, and the mineral-rich highlands of Iran. In return, they brought back timber for construction, stone for sculpture, and precious metals that local craftsmen transformed into objects of breathtaking beauty and complexity. The religious life of Uruk permeated every aspect of daily existence, as the great temples served not only as places of worship, but as economic powerhouses that owned vast estates and employed thousands of workers. The goddess Inanna, fierce and passionate, watched over the city from her sanctuary, while Anu, lord of the heavens, received elaborate offerings in his towering temple. Festival processions wound through the streets at regular intervals, transforming the entire city into a stage for elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the bonds between the human community and the divine forces that governed their world. As Uruk grew beyond anything that had existed before, its inhabitants began to see themselves as part of something larger than family or clan. They became citizens of a true city, bound together by shared walls, common governance, and collective identity. This sense of urban belonging represented a fundamental shift in human consciousness, as people learned to live among strangers, to cooperate in vast enterprises, and to submit to laws and authorities that extended far beyond personal relationships. The city itself became a living entity, greater than the sum of its individual parts, capable of surviving the death of any single ruler or the rise and fall of particular dynasties. The architectural achievements of this first great city spoke to ambitions that reached toward eternity, as builders constructed monuments designed to last for countless generations. Massive walls enclosed neighborhoods and districts, their sun-baked bricks laid in patterns that created both strength and beauty. Public buildings featured courtyards surrounded by columned halls, their flat roofs providing cool spaces for evening gatherings when the desert heat finally released its grip on the urban landscape. The overall effect was of a place that had grown organically from the earth itself, yet possessed an underlying order and purpose that marked it as humanity's first conscious attempt to create a perfect urban environment. By the time Uruk reached its full flowering around 3000 BCE, it had become home to perhaps 40,000 people, making it by far the largest human settlement the world had ever known. Its influence extended across the entire Mesopotamian region, as smaller cities adopted its innovations in government, religion, and technology. The very concept of urban civilization, born within Uruk's walls and along its busy streets, began to spread like ripples across the ancient world, carrying with it the seeds of transformation that would eventually reshape human society from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. In this first great city, humanity had taken its initial steps toward a future of unprecedented complexity and achievement. The great city of Uruk had risen from the alluvial plains like a vision made manifest, its mud brick walls catching the first light of dawn as the Euphrates curved around its edges. Within those walls, something unprecedented was taking shape, structures that would forever alter humanity's relationship with the divine and with power itself. Rising from the heart of the city, the temple platforms began their ascent toward the heavens, each level built upon the last, in a testament to human ambition and spiritual yearning that would echo across millennia. The ziggurat of Uruk emerged from the earth like a mountain crafted by divine hands, its massive foundations sinking deep into the fertile soil, while its terraced levels climbed skyward in perfect geometric progression. Each brick was placed with reverence, each layer added with the understanding that this was more than mere construction. This was the creation of a bridge between the mortal realm and the dwelling place of the gods. The structure's walls, painted in brilliant white lime plaster, caught and reflected the light of the sun, making the entire edifice appear to glow with an inner radiance that could be seen for miles across the flat landscape of southern Mesopotamia. At the summit of this artificial mountain stood the most sacred space in the city, the temple proper, where the god Anu was believed to descend from the heavens to commune with mortals. The walls of this holy chamber were decorated with intricate mosaics of colored stone and shell, depicting scenes of divine abundance and cosmic order. Precious metals gleamed in the flickering light of oil lamps, while the air hung heavy with the scent of burning incense and the offerings of the faithful. Here, in this elevated sanctuary, the boundary between earth and sky became permeable, and the divine will could flow downward to guide the affairs of humanity. The construction of such monuments required not only immense resources, but also a sophisticated understanding of engineering and mathematics that spoke to the advanced nature of Sumerian civilization. Teams of workers, organized with military precision, hauled massive quantities of mud bricks up ramps that spiraled around the growing structure. The logistics of such undertakings demanded centralized planning, coordinated labor, and the ability to sustain thousands of workers over many years. Clay tablets record the careful accounting of materials, the allocation of rations, and the scheduling of work gangs, revealing a bureaucratic sophistication that matched the architectural achievement itself. These temple complexes served as more than places of worship. They were the economic and administrative hearts of their cities, vast institutions that controlled agricultural lands, managed trade relationships, and coordinated the complex web of activities that kept urban civilization functioning. Within their precincts, scribes bent over their tablets in the soft light of reed lamps, recording transactions that spanned the known world. Merchants arrived with caravans laden with cedar wood from distant Lebanon, precious stones from the mountains of Anatolia, and copper from the highlands beyond the horizon. The temples became the repositories of wealth and knowledge, their storerooms filled with grain, and their libraries preserving the accumulated wisdom of generations. From these sacred heights, a new form of leadership emerged. Kings, who claimed divine sanction for their rule, and whose authority derived not merely from personal charisma or military prowess, but from their role as intermediaries between the gods and their people. The earliest Sumerian rulers bore titles that reflected this sacred dimension of kingship, presenting themselves as the chosen servants of the patron deities of their cities. They were Ensi, meaning lord or governor, terms that conveyed both earthly authority and spiritual responsibility. Their palaces rose alongside the temple complexes, creating architectural dialogues between divine and royal power that would influence urban planning for thousands of years. The king's relationship with the temple established patterns of legitimacy that would resonate throughout human history. Royal ceremonies took place within the sacred precincts, where rulers received the symbols of their authority from the priests who served as the gods' earthly representatives. The famous Walker vase from Uruk depicts this sacred transaction in intricate relief, showing processions of offerings flowing upward toward the divine realm, while authority flows downward to sanctify royal rule. These rituals transformed political power into something more than mere coercion. They made it holy, embedding it within the cosmic order itself. The daily life of these early cities revolved around the rhythms established by the temple complexes, their bells and horns marking the hours of prayer, work, and rest that structured urban existence. As dawn broke over the ziggurat's white walls, priests climbed the sacred stairways to perform the morning rituals that awakened the god and ensured the continued favor of heaven. The smoke of sacrificial fires rose from altar flames, carrying the prayers and offerings of the faithful upward into the realm of the divine. Throughout the day, the temple's influence extended into every corner of city life, from the markets where temple-controlled goods were traded to the workshops where artisans labored to create the beautiful objects that adorned the sacred spaces. The architectural innovations pioneered in these early temple complexes represented humanity's first systematic attempt to create monumental architecture, developing techniques and principles that would influence building practices across the ancient world. The use of the arch, the careful calculation of stress and load-bearing capacity, and the integration of decoration with structural elements all emerged from the creative ferment of these sacred construction projects. Master builders, whose names are lost to history, solved engineering problems that had never before been encountered, creating solutions that demonstrated both practical genius and aesthetic sensibility. Within the temple precincts, a priestly class emerged, whose knowledge and skills made them indispensable to the functioning of both religious and secular society. These men and women mastered not only the complex rituals required to maintain divine favor, but also the mathematical and astronomical knowledge needed to predict floods, calculate optimal planting times, and navigate the intricate calendar that governed agricultural and religious activities. Their schools became the first institutions of higher learning, where writing was taught and refined, where literature was created and preserved, and where the intellectual foundations of civilization were carefully laid. The relationship between these temple institutions and the broader population created new forms of social organization that would become characteristic of urban civilization throughout the ancient world. Citizens found themselves bound to the temple not only through religious devotion, but also through economic dependence, as the temple complexes became major employers and the controllers of essential resources. This integration of sacred and secular authority created stable social hierarchies, while also providing mechanisms for social mobility, as talented individuals could rise through temple service to positions of considerable influence and responsibility. The legacy of these first temple builders extended far beyond their immediate architectural achievements, establishing conceptual frameworks that would shape human civilization for millennia to come. The idea that political authority required divine sanction, that monumental architecture could serve as a form of community expression, and that religious institutions should play central roles in economic and social organization. All these concepts first took concrete form in the temple complexes of ancient Sumer. As the sun set behind the western walls of Uruk, casting long shadows across the ziggurat's terraced levels, the foundations had been laid not only for a building, but for a way of organizing human society that would spread across continents and endure across ages, carrying forward the revolutionary vision first realized in the sacred heights of humanity's earliest cities. The towering ziggurats stood as monuments to divine authority, their mud brick walls reaching toward the heavens where gods dwelled in eternal splendor. Within their shadows, scribes bent over clay tablets in temple courtyards, their reed styluses pressed into wet surfaces that would harden into permanence. The morning sun cast long shadows across these sacred precincts, illuminating a revolution so profound that its echoes would resonate through every generation of humanity that followed. In the quiet corners of Uruk's temple complex, where priests managed the vast estates of the gods, necessity birthed innovation with all the inexorable force of a river carving its channel through virgin land. The growing complexity of temple administration demanded solutions that memory alone could no longer provide. Grain stores needed accounting, temple workers required payment records, and the intricate web of offerings, distributions, and sacred obligations wove patterns too complex for the human mind to hold without aid. Clay, abundant along the riverbanks and malleable in skilled hands, offered itself as the medium through which thought could become substance. The earliest marks pressed into clay were simple pictographs, drawings that captured the essence of tangible things with elegant directness. A stylized head of barley represented grain stores, while the curved horns of cattle stood for livestock holdings. Fish swam across clay surfaces in eternal stillness, and the circular impression of the sun marked the passage of days in temple records. These images emerged from the same human impulse that had adorned cave walls tens of thousands of years earlier, yet their purpose transcended mere representation. They served as anchors for memory, external storage for information that exceeded the capacity of individual minds to retain. Within the scriptoriums of Uruk and Ur, where oil lamps flickered against the gathering dusk, scribes developed techniques that transformed mere pictures into something far more powerful. The reed stylus, cut from marshland plants that grew in abundance along the waterways, proved ideally suited to impressing wedge-shaped marks into clay. The cuneiform script that emerged from these practical constraints carried within its angular forms the capacity to capture not merely objects and quantities, but concepts, relationships, and the subtle nuances of human thought itself. The transformation from pictures to abstract symbols unfolded gradually, like the slow metamorphosis of seasonal change. Simple pictographs evolved into ideograms that could represent not only concrete objects, but abstract ideas associated with them. The symbol for mouth came to signify not merely the physical feature, but speech itself, while the pictograph for foot expanded to encompass the concept of walking, standing, or journeying. This conceptual leap marked humanity's first successful attempt to freeze the ephemeral nature of spoken language into permanent form. As merchants ventured beyond the city walls, carrying goods along trade routes that stretched toward distant horizons, the utility of written records became increasingly apparent. Contracts inscribed in clay accompanied caravans crossing vast deserts, their wedge-shaped characters serving as binding agreements between parties separated by months of travel. Bills of lading recorded the contents of cargo, while letters carried messages across distances that would have rendered verbal communication impossible. The written word became the thread that bound far-flung commercial networks into coherent economic systems. Temple schools emerged as centers of learning where young scribes mastered the intricate art of writing under the guidance of learned masters. The curriculum extended far beyond mere literacy, encompassing mathematics, astronomy, law, and literature. Students practiced their characters on clay tablets that could be smoothed flat and reused countless times, their exercises gradually progressing from simple word lists to complex legal documents. The muscle memory required to form hundreds of different cuneiform signs demanded years of dedicated practice, creating a professional class whose skills were highly valued throughout Mesopotamian society. The earliest literary works began to emerge from this literate culture, their authors giving voice to humanity's deepest concerns and highest aspirations. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though it would reach its final form much later, began to take shape in these ancient scriptoriums as scribes recorded oral traditions that had been passed down through generations of storytellers. These tales of heroic adventure, divine intervention, and human mortality represented more than mere entertainment. They constituted humanity's first attempts to explore through written narrative the fundamental questions of existence, death, and the search for meaning. Legal codes began to appear on stone steles and clay tablets, their carefully crafted provisions establishing precedents that would influence jurisprudence for millennia to come. These early laws addressed practical matters of commerce, property rights, and social relationships with a precision that reflected the scribe's growing mastery of written expression. The ability to record legal principles in permanent form created consistency in judicial proceedings and established the foundation for complex governmental systems that could maintain order across increasingly large and diverse populations. Scientific knowledge found new pathways for preservation and transmission through written records that captured astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and medical treatments. Temple astronomers recorded the movements of celestial bodies with meticulous precision, their observations forming databases that enabled increasingly accurate predictions of eclipses, seasonal changes, and agricultural timing. Mathematical texts preserved solutions to complex problems involving area calculations, volume measurements, and numerical relationships that would later influence Greek and Islamic mathematics. Historical consciousness emerged as scribes began recording not merely administrative transactions, but significant events that shaped their communities. Royal inscriptions commemorated military victories, building projects, and diplomatic achievements, while temple chronicles preserved accounts of religious festivals, natural disasters, and social developments. These early historical documents represented humanity's first systematic attempts to understand the past as a sequence of meaningful events that could inform decisions about the present and future. The preservation of cultural memory through written language created unprecedented continuity across generations. Knowledge that had previously existed only in the minds of specialists could now survive the death of its original possessors, creating cumulative advancement in fields ranging from agriculture to architecture. Scribes could study and build upon the work of their predecessors, leading to innovations that would have been impossible without the written preservation of earlier discoveries and insights. Personal correspondence began to reveal the intimate thoughts and daily concerns of individuals whose voices would otherwise have been lost to history. Letters between family members, business partners, and government officials provided glimpses into private lives that complemented the official records kept in temple and palace archives. These personal documents humanized the abstract figures of ancient statistics, revealing the hopes, fears, and relationships that motivated ordinary people living extraordinary times. The physical act of writing itself carried deep symbolic significance in societies that viewed literacy as a divine gift. Scribes occupied positions of respect and influence that extended far beyond their technical skills, serving as intermediaries between the literate elite and the broader population. Their ability to transform fleeting speech into permanent record invested them with power that was both practical and mystical, making them essential participants in the complex ceremonies and administrative procedures that governed Mesopotamian society. As darkness settled over the ancient cities, and oil lamps cast dancing shadows on workshop walls, scribes continued their patient work of pressing meaning into clay. Their reed styluses moved with practiced precision across damp surfaces, creating marks that would outlast the civilizations that produced them. In those quiet hours of concentrated effort, humanity crossed an invisible threshold that separated prehistoric existence from historical consciousness, establishing foundations upon which all subsequent intellectual achievement would rest. The emergence of written language transformed more than just communication. It fundamentally altered the very fabric of society, creating new possibilities for specialization and expertise that would ripple through every corner of Sumerian life. With records now preserved on clay tablets, master craftsmen could document their techniques, pass down intricate knowledge through generations, and establish standards of excellence that elevated their work from mere necessity to true artistry. The potter's wheel spun with newfound precision as techniques were codified, the metalworker's forge burned with carefully recorded temperatures, and the weaver's loom produced textiles of unprecedented complexity and beauty. In the workshops that lined the narrow streets of and Uruk, a revolution of skill was taking place. Master craftsmen, no longer bound by the limitations of oral tradition, could now preserve the exact measurements for bronze alloys, the precise timing for kiln firings, and the intricate patterns that would distinguish Sumerian goods across the ancient world. The rhythmic hammering of copper sheets echoed through courtyards where apprentices learned not just by watching, but by reading detailed instructions carved into clay tablets that would survive millennia. These workshops became centers of innovation where knowledge accumulated like sediment, each generation building upon the documented wisdom of those who came before. The sophistication of Sumerian craftsmanship revealed itself in objects both mundane and magnificent. Bronze daggers emerged from forges with perfectly balanced hilts wrapped in leather and adorned with lapis lazuli, their blades bearing the distinctive patterns that marked them as products of specific workshops. Cylinder seals, those tiny masterpieces of engraving, were carved with microscopic precision, their surfaces bearing intricate scenes of gods and heroes that could be rolled across wet clay to leave perfect impressions. The skill required to create these seals approached the sublime. Each figure, each cuneiform character, each decorative element had to be carved in reverse and in miniature, demanding not just artistic talent, but mathematical precision and an almost supernatural steadiness of hand. Pottery reached heights of technical and aesthetic achievement that would not be surpassed for centuries. The finest Sumerian vessels were thrown with walls so thin they seemed to glow when held to lamplight, their surfaces decorated with geometric patterns of breathtaking complexity. The potter's art extended beyond mere function to encompass entire narrative cycles, with large storage jars bearing sculpted reliefs that told stories of harvest festivals, religious processions, and mythological events. The clay itself became a canvas for Sumerian imagination, transformed from river mud into objects of lasting beauty through techniques that represented the accumulated knowledge of countless generations. The wealth generated by these skilled artisans flowed along trade routes that stretched like arteries across the ancient world, carrying Sumerian goods to distant lands and bringing exotic materials back to enrich the workshops of Mesopotamia. Lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone prized above silver, traveled thousands of miles from the mountains of Afghanistan to be transformed by Sumerian craftsmen into jewelry fit for gods and kings. The precious stone arrived as rough nodules, carefully transported by caravan across treacherous mountain passes and scorching deserts, each piece representing not just material wealth, but the vast network of relationships that made such trade possible. Cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon arrived in Mesopotamia as massive logs, floated down rivers and carried across land by teams of oxen whose journey could take months. This aromatic timber, with its natural resistance to insects and decay, became the foundation for the most important buildings in Sumerian cities. The great temples and royal palaces incorporated Lebanese cedar into their very structure, and the sweet, Resinous scent of the wood perfumed the air around these sacred spaces, creating an olfactory signature that immediately communicated power and divine favor to all who entered. The trade in precious metals created networks of exchange that spanned continents. Silver flowed south from Anatolia in carefully weighed ingots, while gold dust arrived from Nubia in leather pouches sealed with wax and marked with the stamps of distant rulers. Copper came from Cyprus and the mountains of Oman, arriving as standardized bars whose weight and purity were guaranteed by merchant guilds whose reputation depended on absolute honesty in their dealings. These metals were not merely raw materials, but represented stored value, portable wealth that could be transformed into objects of beauty or traded for other necessities across vast distances. The sophistication of Sumerian trade extended far beyond simple barter. Merchant families developed complex systems of credit and debt, recorded meticulously on clay tablets that served as binding contracts enforceable in courts of law. A merchant in Ur could arrange for the delivery of goods to a buyer in distant Assur without ever leaving his home city, relying on a network of agents, standardized weights and measures, and written agreements that made long-distance commerce both practical and profitable. The tablets that recorded these transactions reveal an economic system of startling complexity, with interest rates, delivery schedules, quality guarantees, and penalty clauses that would not look out of place in a modern commercial contract. The wealth that flowed through these trade networks transformed Sumerian society in profound ways. Royal tombs at Ur contained treasures that spoke of connections spanning thousands of miles. Golden helmets hammered from sheets of metal so pure they gleamed like captured sunlight. Headdresses of gold leaves and carnelian beads, arranged with artistic sensibility that elevated personal adornment to high art. And musical instruments, decorated with inlays of shell and lapis lazuli that created visual symphonies to complement the melodies they produced. The famous golden helmet of Mescalamdug, discovered in the royal cemetery, represents not just personal wealth, but the culmination of technological and artistic traditions that had been refined over centuries. The abundance generated by skilled craftsmanship and extensive trade allowed for the emergence of new social classes and occupations. Professional musicians entertained at royal banquets with lyres whose sound boxes were decorated with mythological scenes in gold and silver. Skilled architects designed buildings of unprecedented scale and complexity, their plans preserved on clay tablets that reveal sophisticated understanding of load-bearing principles and aesthetic proportion. Temple prostitutes, marked by their distinctive jewelry and clothing, played important roles in religious ceremonies while also generating considerable revenue for temple complexes that functioned as both spiritual and economic centers. The concentration of wealth in Sumerian cities created the first true urban environments in human history. Streets paved with fired brick provided solid footing even during the seasonal floods, while sophisticated drainage systems carried away waste and excess water. Public fountains supplied clean drinking water drawn from deep wells or distant springs, and public squares provided spaces for markets where goods from across the known world could be examined, evaluated, and purchased. The very air of these cities hummed with commercial activity as merchants hawked their wares, craftsmen demonstrated their skills, and customers from dozens of different cultures mingled in spaces that represented humanity's first truly cosmopolitan environments. The legacy of Sumerian craftsmanship and trade extended far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia, establishing patterns of artistic expression and commercial exchange that would influence civilizations for millennia. The techniques developed in Sumerian workshops spread along trade routes to influence metalworking in Anatolia, pottery making in the Indus Valley, and textile production in Egypt. The very concept of standardized weights and measures, essential for honest trade, became a Sumerian gift to the world, enabling commerce on a scale that had never before been possible, and laying the foundation for the complex global economy that would eventually embrace every corner of the earth. Through clay tablets and bronze tools, through golden ornaments and silver ingots, through the patient accumulation of knowledge and the bold expansion of trade, the Sumerians created not just wealth, but the very infrastructure of civilization itself. The wealth flowing through these early trade networks began to concentrate in the hands of those who could control and coordinate the increasingly complex web of commerce, craftsmanship, and agricultural production. As the cities of Sumer grew larger and more prosperous, the simple equality of earlier village life gave way to something entirely new in human experience: the emergence of distinct social classes, each with its own role, responsibilities, and relationship to power. The master craftsmen, with their specialized knowledge and valuable goods, found themselves occupying a middle tier between those who worked the earth and those who would come to rule over vast territories and populations. At the apex of this emerging hierarchy stood figures whose authority derived not merely from personal charisma or temporary leadership, but from their claimed connection to the divine realm itself. The earliest kings of Mesopotamia were not simply military commanders or wealthy merchants, but individuals who positioned themselves as intermediaries between the earthly city and the celestial powers that governed the cosmos. Their palaces, rising like artificial mountains from the flat alluvial plains, served as both administrative centers and sacred spaces where the business of governing merged seamlessly with the rituals of worship and divine consultation. These royal compounds, excavated layer by archaeologists, reveal spaces of breathtaking grandeur and meticulous organization. Throne rooms with walls decorated in intricate mosaics depicted the king receiving tribute from distant lands, while smaller chambers housed the scribes who recorded every transaction, every legal decision, every royal decree in the wedge-shaped marks that would become humanity's first writing system. The royal household itself was a miniature city, complete with workshops where artisans created objects of unprecedented luxury, kitchens that could feed hundreds of guests and retainers, and storage areas filled with the wealth of empire. Precious metals, exotic stones, rare woods, and quantities of grain that could sustain the palace through years of poor harvests. Working in close partnership with these earthly rulers were the priests, whose authority flowed from their mastery of the complex rituals and sacred knowledge that maintained the cosmic order. The temple complexes of early Mesopotamia were not merely places of worship, but economic powerhouses that controlled vast estates, employed hundreds of workers, and accumulated wealth through offerings, agricultural production, and commercial enterprises. The high priests moved through these sacred precincts with the quiet authority of those who spoke directly with the gods, their linen robes rustling against stone floors worn smooth by countless ceremonial processions. These religious leaders maintained elaborate calendars that dictated when to plant and harvest, when to conduct important ceremonies, and when the gods were most likely to look favorably upon human endeavors. Their knowledge extended beyond the purely spiritual to encompass mathematics, astronomy, and the practical arts of irrigation and construction. In temple schools, young scribes learned not only the intricate cuneiform writing system, but also the mathematical calculations needed to survey fields, measure grain stores, and predict the flooding of rivers. The boundary between sacred and secular knowledge remained beautifully fluid, with each reinforcing and legitimizing the other. The relationship between kings and priests was one of mutual dependence and occasional tension, as both groups sought to maintain their authority while serving the needs of an increasingly complex society. Royal inscriptions from this period describe elaborate temple-building projects undertaken at divine command, while religious texts carefully outline the proper relationship between earthly and heavenly power. The king might be divinely chosen, but the priests were the guardians of the knowledge that made such divine selection meaningful and comprehensible to the general population. Below these exalted figures, yet far above the common farmers and laborers, emerged a sophisticated class of administrators, merchants, and skilled professionals who kept the machinery of civilization running smoothly. These individuals, many of whom could read and write, served as the vital link between the grand pronouncements of palace and temple and the daily realities of urban life. They collected taxes, organized work gangs, supervised construction projects, and maintained the detailed records that allowed these early states to function with remarkable efficiency across territories that encompassed dozens of settlements and thousands of people. The merchants, who had once been relatively independent traders, now found themselves increasingly integrated into these hierarchical structures, their activities regulated and taxed by royal officials, their long-distance expeditions often financed by temple treasuries or palace storehouses. Yet this integration brought benefits as well as restrictions, as royal protection extended to trade routes, standardized weights and measures made commerce more predictable, and the concentration of wealth in urban centers created markets for luxury goods on a scale previously unimaginable. At the foundation of this entire social edifice remained the farmers, whose labor in the fertile fields surrounding each city provided the agricultural surplus that made all other activities possible. These were no longer the independent smallholders of earlier times, but increasingly specialized agricultural workers operating within a complex system of land tenure, taxation, and labor obligation. Some worked temple lands directly, their harvests flowing into sacred storehouses to support priestly activities and provide security against famine. Others cultivated royal estates, their produce feeding the palace household and supporting royal building projects and military expeditions. The daily rhythm of agricultural life continued much as it had for generations, with the rising sun calling workers to the fields and the setting sun marking the end of another day's labor. Yet even here, in the most fundamental of human activities, the influence of the emerging hierarchy made itself felt. Royal officials recorded crop yields, priestly calendars determined optimal planting times, and the surplus that had once belonged entirely to the farming community now flowed upward through increasingly sophisticated networks of tribute, taxation, and religious obligation. The workshops and residential quarters of the cities revealed the emergence of additional social gradations within the broad category of common people. Master craftsmen commanded respect and relative prosperity, their skills essential to the creation of the luxury goods and religious objects that marked high status. Their apprentices occupied a middle position, learning valuable trades while serving established masters. At the bottom of the urban hierarchy were the laborers and servants, whose muscle power moved the massive stone blocks that built palaces and temples, carried water from distant sources, and performed the countless menial tasks that kept city life functioning. This stratification of society brought with it the world's first legal codes, as rulers sought to maintain order and justice within communities that had grown too large and complex for informal dispute resolution. The earliest law codes, carved into stone monuments and placed in public spaces, reveal a sophisticated understanding of social relationships and economic transactions. They established different penalties for crimes, depending on the social status of both perpetrator and victim, codified the rights and obligations of various social classes, and created formal mechanisms for resolving the disputes that inevitably arose in such complex communities. Women within this hierarchical system occupied varied positions depending on their birth, marriage, and individual circumstances. Royal women might wield considerable influence as queens, regents, or high priestesses, while the wives and daughters of merchants and craftsmen could inherit property and participate in commercial activities. The goddess Inanna herself served as a powerful model of female authority, her temples staffed by priestesses who commanded respect and controlled significant economic resources. The emergence of these social hierarchies marked a fundamental transformation in human organization, creating the template for virtually all subsequent civilizations. Yet this transformation occurred gradually, over generations, as communities adapted to the challenges and opportunities presented by urban life, agricultural surplus, and increasingly sophisticated technology. The farmers who worked the ancient fields of Sumer could hardly have imagined that their daily labor was supporting the birth of kingship, the elaboration of religious ceremony, and the development of the administrative systems that would govern human societies for millennia to come. As these structured hierarchies took root in the fertile crescent between the rivers, something extraordinary began to flourish alongside the practical matters of governance and grain storage. From the minds of those who had witnessed the birth of civilization itself came stories that would echo through millennia, tales that sought to make sense of existence in ways that laws and ledgers never could. The scribes, who had learned to capture the mundane transactions of daily commerce, discovered they possessed something far more powerful than administrative efficiency. They held the keys to preserving the deepest longings and fears of the human heart. In the shadowed chambers of Uruk's great temple, where oil lamps flickered against cuneiform tablets, the story of Gilgamesh began to take shape beneath careful stylus strokes. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerged not as a single moment of inspiration, but as a slow accretion of tales told around countless fires, refined through generations of retelling until it crystallized into the world's first great literary masterpiece. The historical king, who may have ruled Uruk around 2700 BCE, became something far grander in the collective imagination, a figure who embodied all the contradictions and aspirations of humanity's first urban experiment. The epic opens in a city that pulses with the rhythm of civilization itself, where the walls of Uruk gleam like copper in the sun, and the streets teem with artisans, merchants, and laborers whose lives are governed by the complex social contracts their ancestors had never known. Gilgamesh himself is portrayed as both the pinnacle of kingly power and its most dangerous expression, a ruler so mighty that his very strength becomes a burden to his people. The story acknowledges what these early city dwellers had learned through hard experience, that concentrated power, while necessary for organizing complex society, carried within it the seeds of tyranny. When the gods create Enkidu to challenge Gilgamesh, they fashion him from clay in the wilderness, a being who embodies the pre-civilized state from which all Sumerians knew their ancestors had emerged. Enkidu runs with the gazelles and drinks from streams alongside wild cattle, representing not just personal innocence, but the collective memory of humanity's nomadic past. His eventual seduction away from this natural state by a temple courtesan speaks to the irreversible transformation that urbanization had wrought upon the human condition. The story suggests that civilization, for all its gifts, requires the sacrifice of something elemental and pure. The friendship that develops between these two figures, the over-civilized king and the man fresh from the wilderness, becomes a meditation on balance, on the necessity of tempering culture with nature, authority with wildness. Their first meeting erupts in violence as they grapple in the streets of Uruk, but this combat transforms into recognition and ultimately into a bond deeper than brotherhood. Together, they embark on adventures that take them far from the ordered world of the city, seeking glory in the dark cedar forests guarded by the monster Humbaba, confronting forces that represent the chaotic powers that civilization seeks to contain and control. The forest itself becomes a character in the epic, dense and primordial, filled with trees so tall they seem to hold up the very heavens. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu fell these ancient cedars to build monuments to their names, they commit an act of environmental destruction that resonates with particular poignancy for modern listeners. But for the Sumerians, it represented something more complex, the necessary assertion of human will against the untamed forces of nature, even as it came at a terrible cost. The death of Humbaba, guardian of the forest's sanctity, foreshadows the price that such victories demand. The god's revenge comes not through direct punishment, but through the illness and death of Enkidu, and it is here that the epic transforms from adventure story into something far more profound. Gilgamesh's grief over his friend's death becomes the driving force for the remainder of the tale, launching him on a quest that will take him to the edges of the known world in search of immortality. His mourning is described with raw intensity. He tears his clothes, covers himself with dust, and wanders the wilderness like a wild animal, unable to accept that death is the common fate of all humanity. This section of the epic speaks to anxieties that were entirely new in human experience. For the first time in history, people lived lives so removed from the daily struggle for survival that they had leisure to contemplate abstract concepts like mortality and meaning. The security that civilization provided paradoxically made death seem less acceptable, not more so. Where nomadic peoples had lived with death as a constant companion, the Sumerians had created conditions that allowed them to postpone such encounters. making them all the more shocking when they finally arrived. Gilgamesh's journey takes him beyond the boundaries of the civilized world, through landscapes that grow increasingly strange and otherworldly. He travels through mountain passes, where scorpion people guard the gates of the sun, across waters of death that no living person has ever navigated, seeking out Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood that had once destroyed the world. These mythological elements serve multiple purposes in the narrative, providing entertainment, certainly, but also encoding practical and spiritual wisdom about the limits of human ambition and the necessity of accepting one's place in the cosmic order. The flood narrative embedded within the epic predates the biblical account by more than a millennium, representing perhaps humanity's first great attempt to grapple with catastrophic change through storytelling. Utnapishtim's tale of divine wrath and survival speaks to the precarious nature of civilization itself, how quickly the ordered world can dissolve into chaos, how dependent human achievement is upon forces beyond human control. For the Sumerians, who lived always at the mercy of unpredictable floods along the Tigris and Euphrates, this story carried immediate relevance, while also serving as a universal meditation on impermanence. When Utnapishtim finally reveals to Gilgamesh the location of the plant of youth, growing in the depths of the cosmic ocean, the hero's brief triumph in obtaining it gives way to ultimate defeat when a serpent steals the precious herb while he bathes in a spring. This final frustration completes Gilgamesh's education in the nature of mortality, teaching him that immortality belongs to the gods alone, and that human greatness must be measured not in duration but in the quality and impact of one's actions during the brief span of earthly life. The epic concludes not with despair, but with a kind of mature acceptance, as Gilgamesh returns to Uruk with new wisdom about the proper relationship between human ambition and cosmic limits. The walls of his city, which began the story as symbols of his pride, are transformed by the narrative into monuments to collective human achievement, structures that will outlast any individual life while remaining subject to the larger cycles of rise and decay that govern all earthly things. The story suggests that true immortality lies not in personal survival, but in the contribution one makes to the ongoing project of civilization itself. These themes resonated so powerfully with Sumerian audiences that the Epic of Gilgamesh became the template for countless later stories, its influence spreading far beyond Mesopotamia to shape the mythologies of cultures across the ancient world. The epic established patterns of heroic narrative that continue to inform human storytelling to this day. But more than that, it represented a new way of thinking about the human condition, one that took seriously both the grandeur and the limitations of mortal existence, that found meaning in struggle, even when that struggle was ultimately futile. Through such stories, the Sumerians created something unprecedented in human culture, a body of literature that served not merely to preserve information or provide entertainment, but to explore the deepest questions about existence, morality, and the proper conduct of life. These tales became the foundation upon which all subsequent human wisdom literature would build, establishing the power of narrative to illuminate truths that could not be captured through law, science, or philosophy alone. The great stories of Gilgamesh and the pantheon of Mesopotamian deities had taught these ancient peoples something profound about the nature of existence, about heroism and mortality, about the complex relationship between divine will and human aspiration. Yet, as these epic narratives settled into the collective consciousness of Sumerian society, spreading from temple to marketplace, from scribe's academy to farmer's hearth, another equally monumental transformation was taking shape in the corridors of power. The same civilization that had given birth to the world's first written literature was now pioneering an innovation that would prove equally revolutionary: the codification of law itself, carved not in the shifting sands of oral tradition, but in the permanent embrace of stone. The transition from myth to law represented more than mere administrative necessity. It embodied humanity's growing confidence in its ability to create order from chaos, to impose rational structure upon the unpredictable currents of human behavior. Where once disputes had been settled by the whims of local strongmen or the cryptic pronouncements of temple oracles, the Sumerians began to envision something far more systematic, a comprehensive framework of rules that would govern everything from commercial transactions to family relations, from property rights to criminal punishment. The very act of committing these principles to stone reflected a profound shift in consciousness, an acknowledgement that justice itself could be made tangible, permanent, and universal. The earliest legal codes emerged from the practical needs of increasingly complex urban societies. As Mesopotamian cities grew larger and more diverse, as trade networks expanded across vast distances and brought together peoples of different customs and traditions, the informal mechanisms of dispute resolution that had sufficed for smaller communities began to strain under the weight of new challenges. Merchants arriving from distant lands needed assurance that their contracts would be honored according to consistent standards. Artisans required protection for their innovations and creations. Farmers sought guarantees that their irrigation rights would be respected season after season. The temple complexes, with their vast holdings and intricate hierarchies, demanded clear protocols for managing their earthly affairs. Into this swirling cauldron of competing interests and conflicting traditions stepped a succession of Mesopotamian rulers who would leave their mark not through conquest alone, but through the patient work of legal innovation. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to approximately 2100 BCE, stands as one of humanity's earliest systematic attempts to articulate the principles of justice in written form. This ancient document, inscribed in cuneiform upon clay tablets, established precedents that would echo through millennia: the concept of proportional punishment, the protection of the vulnerable, the standardization of weights and measures, and the crucial principle that even rulers themselves were bound by the laws they proclaimed. The stone monuments that housed these legal codes became more than mere repositories of information. They transformed into sacred objects in their own right, physical manifestations of the cosmic order that the gods had supposedly ordained for human society. The famous law code of Hammurabi, erected some 3 centuries after Ur-Nammu's pioneering work, exemplified this fusion of legal authority and religious symbolism. Standing nearly 8 feet tall and carved from gleaming black diorite, the stele presented an imposing figure. At its apex, a relief carving depicted Hammurabi himself, receiving the laws directly from the sun god Shamash, divine patron of justice and righteousness. Below this celestial commission, hundreds of individual legal provisions were inscribed in elegant cuneiform script, covering everything from trade regulations to family law, from property disputes to criminal sanctions. The physical presence of these monuments in the public squares and temple courtyards of Mesopotamian cities created a new relationship between ruler and ruled, between the abstract concept of law and the daily reality of urban life. Citizens walking past these towering steles could see, quite literally, the foundations upon which their society rested. The permanence of stone conveyed the immutable nature of justice, while the public accessibility of the inscriptions suggested that law was not the private preserve of priests and nobles, but the common inheritance of all who lived within the city's protective embrace. Scribes would gather around these monuments to make copies, ensuring that the legal principles would spread throughout the kingdom and beyond, carried by merchants and diplomats to distant lands where they would influence the development of other legal traditions. The content of these ancient codes reveals a sophisticated understanding of human nature and social dynamics that would not seem entirely foreign to modern observers. The laws addressed the fundamental challenges that arise whenever people attempt to live together in large groups: questions of property ownership and theft, marriage and divorce, inheritance and adoption, contracts and commercial fraud. The punishments prescribed often reflected the principle of proportional justice, with different standards applied based on the social status of both perpetrator and victim. A noble who injured a commoner faced different consequences than a commoner who injured a noble, revealing the hierarchical nature of these ancient societies, while simultaneously establishing that even the powerful were subject to legal constraint. The economic provisions of these codes illuminate the remarkable sophistication of Mesopotamian commercial life. Detailed regulations governed the activities of merchants, establishing standard rates for loans and defining the responsibilities of agents who conducted business on behalf of absent partners. The laws addressed the complex challenges of irrigation agriculture, specifying penalties for those who failed to maintain their portion of the canal system or who diverted water beyond their rightful share. Elaborate provisions governed the activities of various craftsmen and professionals. Builders who constructed defective houses, surgeons whose patients died under their care, boat captains who lost their cargo through negligence. Perhaps most remarkably, these ancient legal codes demonstrated an early recognition of what would later be called due process. The idea that accusations must be substantiated through evidence and testimony, that the accused had certain rights, and that judgment should be rendered according to established procedures rather than arbitrary whim. The laws specified the roles of witnesses and the circumstances under which their testimony would be accepted or rejected. They established protocols for investigating crimes and gathering evidence. They even addressed the problem of false accusation, imposing severe penalties on those who brought frivolous or malicious charges against their neighbors. The influence of these Mesopotamian legal innovations extended far beyond the boundaries of ancient Sumer and Babylon. As trade networks carried Mesopotamian merchants to distant shores, they brought with them not only goods and technologies, but also legal concepts and practices that would take root in foreign soil. The Hebrew legal traditions preserved in the biblical texts show clear influence from Mesopotamian precedents. Greek and Roman law, though developing along somewhat different lines, incorporated principles first articulated in the cuneiform codes of ancient Iraq. Medieval Islamic jurisprudence drew upon legal concepts that could be traced back to these ancient stone monuments. The legacy of Mesopotamian legal innovation reaches even further than specific provisions or procedures. It encompasses the fundamental idea that human society can be governed by rational, consistent principles, rather than the arbitrary will of the powerful. The concept that law should be written down, made public, and applied equally to similar cases represents one of humanity's most crucial intellectual achievements. The stone monuments of ancient Mesopotamia stood not merely as records of specific legal provisions, but as declarations of faith in the possibility of justice itself, tangible proof that human beings could create systems of governance worthy of their highest aspirations. In the flickering lamplight of ancient scribal schools, young students would practice copying these legal texts, their reed styluses carefully forming each cuneiform character as they absorbed not merely the specific provisions, but the underlying principles that made civilization possible. The patient work of these anonymous scribes, preserving and transmitting the legal wisdom of their ancestors, represents one of humanity's most enduring achievements. The transformation of justice from an abstract ideal into a concrete reality, carved permanently in stone and embedded forever in the foundations of human society. In the quiet museums of the world, where dust motes dance through shafts of afternoon light, ancient tablets rest behind glass cases, like sleeping memories waiting to be awakened. These fragments of clay, pressed with the wedge-shaped marks that once carried the thoughts and dreams of Sumerian scribes, speak across millennia with a voice that grows neither hoarse nor weary with age. The cuneiform characters, each one a tiny miracle of human ingenuity, continue their eternal conversation with anyone willing to listen, their angular forms holding within them the very DNA of written civilization. The legacy of Sumer flows through time like an underground river, sometimes visible on the surface, sometimes hidden beneath layers of subsequent history, but always present, always nourishing the roots of human achievement. In every alphabet that graces a page, in every law that seeks to balance justice with mercy, in every city that rises from plains and riverbanks, the ghost of ancient Mesopotamia whispers its influence. The scribes who first pressed reed styluses into wet clay could never have imagined that their simple act of recording grain distributions and temple offerings would become the foundation upon which all future knowledge would be built. Walking through any modern city at twilight, as lights begin to flicker on in countless windows and the rhythm of urban life settles into its evening cadence, one can sense the ancient pulse that beats beneath the concrete and steel. The grid patterns of streets, the centralized administration that keeps water flowing and waste moving, the markets where goods from distant lands change hands with nothing more than marks on paper or digital signals. All of these echo the innovations first pioneered in places like Uruk and Ur, where the fundamental architecture of civilization was laid stone by stone, law by law, tablet by tablet. The concept of the individual, of personal identity, recorded and recognized by society, began in those reed-lined canals of southern Mesopotamia, where names were first pressed into clay seals and rolled across contracts. Every passport carried today, every birth certificate filed away in dusty government archives, every signature that validates a human presence in the world, traces its ancestry back to those first moments when the Sumerians decided that people needed to be counted, recorded, and remembered. The bureaucracy that modern life both depends upon and chafes against was born in the temple complexes of ancient cities, where priests first understood that managing thousands of people required systems more sophisticated than memory and tradition. Literature itself, that fundamental human urge to tell stories that matter, to preserve the great deeds and cosmic truths that give meaning to existence, found its first voice in the epic tales that emerged from Sumerian culture. The story of Gilgamesh, with its meditation on friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning in the face of death, continues to resonate in every novel, every film, every song that grapples with what it means to be human. The themes that Sumerian poets explored, love and loss, the relationship between mortals and the divine, the struggle to create something lasting in a world of constant change, remain the eternal concerns of human art and literature. In the realm of technology, the Sumerian genius for practical innovation echoes through every mechanical device that makes modern life possible. The wheel, perhaps humanity's greatest technological breakthrough, still turns beneath every vehicle that carries people across continents, every gear that transfers power in countless machines, every pottery wheel where artists shape clay with the same fundamental motions their ancient predecessors mastered 6,000 years ago. The mathematical principles the Sumerians developed to survey their fields and calculate their harvests underlie every architectural wonder, every bridge that spans a river, every spacecraft that navigates the vast darkness between worlds. The very concept of time as something measurable and divisible, the foundation of all scheduling and planning, bears the fingerprints of Sumerian astronomers who watched the stars wheel overhead and divided their observations into the 60-minute hours and 60-second minutes that still govern the pace of global life. When a commuter checks their watch or a scientist measures the half-life of an element, they participate in a tradition of precise timekeeping that began in the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, where priest astronomers first realized that the heavens moved according to patterns that could be predicted and recorded. Even the spiritual dimensions of human existence show the lasting influence of Sumerian thought. The great religious traditions that shaped the ancient world drew deeply from the well of Mesopotamian mythology and theology, carrying forward concepts of divine justice, cosmic order, and the relationship between earthly rulers and heavenly authority. The idea that laws come from a divine source, that kings rule by celestial mandate, that human society reflects a greater cosmic hierarchy. These foundational principles of governance and spirituality first found expression in the religious texts and royal inscriptions of Sumerian civilization. As night settles over the archaeological sites where these ancient cities once thrived, where the mud brick walls have long since returned to the earth from which they came, the silence holds a peculiar quality. It is not the silence of emptiness, but rather the profound quiet that comes after a great symphony has ended, when the last notes still seem to vibrate in the air. The wind that moves across these ancient tell mounds carries with it the accumulated whispers of millennia, the voices of farmers and merchants, priests and kings, scribes and artists who lived and loved and dreamed in humanity's first great urban experiment. The dust that settles on these ruins is not merely the debris of collapsed buildings, but the physical remains of the first human attempt to build something permanent, something that would outlast the span of individual lives and connect generations across the vast spaces of time. Every grain of sand that shifts in the desert wind was once part of a brick that formed a wall, a foundation, a temple where people gathered to make sense of their place in the cosmos. The Sumerians have become the dust beneath the archaeologist's brush, but their ideas, their innovations, their fundamental insights into the possibilities of human cooperation and creativity continue to shape every aspect of contemporary existence. In this eternal legacy, there is both triumph and melancholy, the bittersweet recognition that all human achievements must eventually return to Earth while their influence flows onward like water finding the sea. The Sumerian experiment in civilization succeeded beyond its creators' wildest dreams, spreading across continents and millennia, touching every subsequent culture with its innovations and insights. Yet the people who began it all have faded into legend, their individual voices lost in the great chorus of history, their names known only to specialists who can still read their ancient scripts. The last light fades from the horizon over Mesopotamia, and the stars that once guided Sumerian astronomers in their observations continue their eternal dance overhead, indifferent to the rise and fall of human civilizations, yet somehow blessing with their constancy this small planet, where, once upon a time, people first learned to write down their dreams and build their visions in clay and stone. In that cosmic perspective, the Sumerian legacy achieves its final transformation, becoming not just the foundation of human culture, but a testament to the species' irrepressible urge to create meaning from chaos, to build beauty from dust, and to leave something lasting in the endless flow of time.